is an unrehearsed program. The views expressed are those of the guests and not necessarily those of the producer. Today's topic:
The Secret Lives of Interrogators in Passion for Truth, award-winning program.
Welcome to another edition of Passion for Truth. Do interrogators live tortured lives like their victims, or are they partially aware that they were perpetrators of wrongdoings? Do they get paralyzed with guilt later on, and do they feel differently depending on whether they tortured people in a democratic or undemocratic countries? All next with our panelist Bob Price, one of the leading attorneys in the Washington metropolitan area, and Buwalda, Director, Jubilee Campaign and owner, Just Law International, John Culbertson, Chief Executive Officer, Culbertson and Company, also former administrator for the 17th Congressional District of Ohio, Dr. Amarjeet Singh, Director, Voices for Freedom, also a columnist for several newspapers, and George Nesterchek from the management consulting firm Nesterchek and Associates, former staff director for the U.S. House of Representatives. Welcome you all.
Thank you.
Starting with you, Bob, what do you think? Is it true that the interrogators generally feel that their hurtful actions were justified or could have been prevented?
Well, I think most of them feel that their actions are justified. And answering the question you asked at the top of the program, at the very beginning, is are they themselves, they feel guilt? I think that depends upon what type of a society they come from. When more democratic countries have descended to the use of torture, those people who do it often feel very conflicted and therefore guilty afterwards. Countries where there's been no history of democracy and the equality of man, those people very easily torture without any sense of guilt or wrongdoing.
Well, and the culture of a democratic country, as you know, emphasizes equal justice for all, so they are partially aware that their actions were terrible. They did something terrible.
Well, I think those who are assigned to doing so must come to some conclusion in their own minds that what they are doing is going to save lives. If you're coming from a democratic country and you are perpetrating acts of torture, you wouldn't, I don't think, want to be doing that as your line of work, as your profession, unless you feel that in some way you're saving lives. And those that have been interviewed in different studies do actually say, well, we did this because extracting this information would have prevented more deaths of innocent civilians or even of military troops, depending on the circumstances of when they were undertaking the acts of torture.
How do they resolve it, John, if they were raised to value the principles of equality, equal justice, raised in a democratic country? How do they resolve it when they use extreme methods of torture?
Well, first of all, I think sometimes we have expanded the definition of torture to include a number of things that probably aren't torture. Secondly, you need to look at the setting. There was a case a number of years ago of, I believe, Colonel West, who put a gun to the head of a prisoner and said, "Tell me where this attack is coming from." That was in the middle of a war. He had impending danger for himself and his troops, as opposed to someone who simply locks someone up and over a period of time wants to extract it. Torture is not a very good tool for information. However, you've got to strike a balance. It's easy for the hunter to become the hunted. And it doesn't matter if it's torture or even we find that even among police forces. That's why we rotate detectives off of certain details because after a while they tend to become what they're searching for, and it's a natural human tendency. So many questions. It's hard to answer.
When they stage an execution, staged execution, or when they use hypothermia, a part of them, Dr. Singh, feels guilty, and another part feels very good and find it thrilling. How do you resolve it? How do you fight the bad guys and stay good?
I think in the Indian context, and particularly in the Punjab context, where for 20 years over 150,000 Sikh youngsters were arrested, tortured, many killed in fake staged encounters, one thing is very clear, that still in Indian context, when we say interrogator, I think interrogator and torturer, they are the synonymous words there. And even Amnesty International has reported that every prisoner or everybody arrested in India is tortured to some degree. So when it comes to police force and all, that is the training of British colonial period for over 100 years, that the same methods are continued. Many of those who were employed by the police in specific interrogation centers in Punjab later revealed to their near and dear ones and all that we were always drunk while we carried that torturing process. Now it may be a debate that whether they were sadistic even before they joined that kind of work, or whether after doing that they become that. But certainly most of them after their retirement and all are not the normal human beings. Many go for psychiatric treatment and others are abusive in their own families. So whether it is a matter of guilt on their part, or it was already some mental makeup of theirs which brought them to this field and they became the worst torturers. But some of them earn the reputation that, say, like if some prisoner is in Jalandhar and he is not telling anything, they'll say, bring such and such person from Amritsar, he can make even walls speak. So I think they are mentally sick kind of people as well.
But George, do they reinterpret their own actions to minimize responsibility?
Well, I would think so, because this is the kind of moral dilemma where you raise the question, do the ends justify the means? In a wartime situation where lives are at stake, then coming short of killing a prisoner, but being very rough in their questioning may be justifiable for the sake of saving lives. And under other circumstances, it probably isn't. And the point that you raised about Western societies versus democratic societies versus non-democratic, even in democratic societies, the question of torture is limited and circumscribed, and there are rules and limitations on it. And if you find people that are willing to live by those rules, they probably are the ones that get the most conflicted. And if they don't live by those rules and they're sadists and enjoy it, you probably don't want them to be doing the interrogating, because they're going to violate your own rules. So, I mean, you know, there are problems with it, whether you're dealing with the issues in a democratic society or in a non-democratic society. And in a non-democratic society, chances are that what we consider torture would be just normal routine questioning. And the excesses that we don't accept probably fall under the realm of torture there. So it's a spectrum, and depending on where you come from, you might be on one end of it or the other, but it's a very slippery moral quagmire that you're in there.
One of the problems that you really have to distinguish here is, are we talking about in a war situation, and then of course in modern times and contemporary times, who knows where the lines of a war are when you deal with, you know, the kind of fluid situations we have now as opposed to battle lines and armies. But the other thing is, over the centuries we've had torturers who were more institutionalized, for instance, jailers. But that's a self-selected group. I think people who are jailers self-select to become a jailer are more apt, if that society tortures their prisoners. I suspect, although I have no scientific basis for this, they have a whole lot less guilt and problems with it afterwards or after the fact than soldiers would who are taken into a war period, and that's not their calling, and it's not self-selected to be a jailer.
And
I think it's a very good point, and I also would draw in as an example North Korea, because there you have the practice in the gulags today, modern day torturing. There's testimonies you can find on the internet for somebody, say, Sunuk Lee. She wrote a book about the tailless animals. Okay, the reason why